This is our, I believe, fourth Zoom GAR Hall special event. And they've been going really well. A couple glitches, as you can see, but everything's been going great. And thank you for coming. We appreciate you taking the time tonight to sit here with us and watch these presentations. So a couple of things before we start. Please keep your microphones muted. If you have a question you want answered, put it in the chat, and at the end of the presentation, Lyle will get to as many of those as he can. There's also a few other things in the chat. This is free and open to the public. The Historical Society is not charging for these programs, but donations are certainly welcome, and they're always appreciated. I've put down the PayPal information and the mailing address if you'd like to send in a donation, but please do not feel that it's necessary. I've put down all the people who are going to be joining us. Well, there's a couple that are missing, but all the upcoming programs. To see more, follow Scituate Historical Society on Facebook, or if you'd like, send us an email. I'll put the email in the chat as well, and we'll get you on the mailing list. So now we have got longtime friend of the Scituate Historical Society. He is an author. He is a historian. He is a volunteer at the Historical Society, all around wonderful gentleman. Most of you know him, Lyle Nyberg, and he's going to talk about the women of Scituate and how we helped with getting the vote. So Lyle, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks everybody for attending. I'm going to talk about the women and men who are suffragists and spent summers in Scituate. And it's a surprising number of nationally recognized suffragists spent summers in Scituate. So I'll be talking about their stays here, why they came here, and I've got a chart talking, kind of giving you an overview of that. I just wanted to mention at the bottom of your screen, if you move your mouse down there, there's a button called chat, and just click on that and you could type away with all your questions. It'd be good to accumulate them as we go along. So it's a little bit different from a real life presentation when we usually don't call on the audience until the very end. And let's see what else. Oh, I'd encourage you to donate to the Scituate Historical Society, who is sponsoring this and many other great events. So, and thank you to Jean, thank you to Seth, who's working behind the scenes to make us look good. Probably I should say a word about how this happened, because I just wrote a book. It's my first book. Actually, this is my first Zoom conference call. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes with the book too, but I'm pretty happy with it. It came about because a year ago in July, about July 1st, I had been working for a couple years on the history of Scituate, kind of starting with my neighborhood here on Third Cliff and moving outward. And I've kind of gotten a little bit into Cohasset too, but I'm going to try to stick to the geographic boundaries there. And I thought, you know what? I've got a bunch of people here who were involved with the suffrage movement. I didn't know really anything about the suffrage movement, but then I thought, you know, next year, 2020 is going to be the centennial of the adoption of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the vote. So there's a book in this. So I started writing, and within a few days, I found a woman named Judith Smith. I'd never run across her on my radar before. And it turns out she's one of my favorite suffragists. She and her family spent summers at the Scituate Lighthouse, and we'll be talking about her later on. So she was just a fascinating, interesting person, along with the other ones I'm going to talk about tonight too. So I think that's about it for it. Oh yeah, then I said, oh, this is great. You know, I've got a lot to write about now. It looks like there's a book in this. Maybe I'll be done in a couple months. And well, I just finished about July 1st of this year. Then I had to worry about publishing. I got a lot of great help from Susanna Green, who worked on the cover and helped me go through this book design, which is what the inside of the book looks like. after I've written all this stuff. So the publishing part of it is totally different. And now promotion is totally different too. So it's kind of going through a lot of phases. I also want to mention, in case I don't remember it, that there's a great map that I'll be showing you from John Roman, who's also from Scituate. So this is very much a Scituate-based product, but it also touches on some national themes like voting, which is very much in the news today, and will be in the next, I guess, 4 weeks or so, maybe longer. So I'm going to share my presentation with you. I'll be talking behind the scenes here, and let's see if I can do this right. Yeah, I think we're there. View. View. Slideshow. All right, and we're off. The poster on the left here is what came out for this presentation, and that was also done by Susanna Green. I'm going to be talking about why did these suffragists who are nationally known come to Scituate? Who were they? Where did they stay in Scituate? What did they do for women's suffrage? And I'd be happy to take your questions. So one of the reasons, and I want to first talk about the cover of the book, which is shown on the left. You might think it's two different, really totally disconnected pieces. My sister Janet had suggested putting two on the cover and said I was just going to put the one on the cover and one on the back, but I think they work together. The top is Peggotty Beach. It's from an old postcard. It's view from Second Cliff looking at Third Cliff. And most of the suffragists I'll be talking about lived on Second Cliff and Third Cliff. And this is a scene, of course, in the summer. The bottom of the cover is a bunch of picketers who, from the National Women's Party, who were picketing the White House in January 24, 1917. That was just a week after they started picketing what they called silent sentinels for suffrage. And this was a pretty major move. This had never happened before. And so picketing the White House was a big deal at the time. And a lot of people thought the National Women's Party had gone too far. They were the more militant branch of the women's suffrage movement. It's interesting, you know, the top is summer, the bottom is winter, but there are some really big connections between the two. The top is near the home of Inez Haynes Irwin on Second Cliff. On Third Cliff, which you see in the distance there, was the home of Marie Moore Forrest. And both those two women were on the executive committee of the National Women's Party. So those were some of the more militant ones. And actually Marie Moore Forrest was there at the what would have been the signing of the 19th Amendment, recognizing that they're certified by the Secretary of State. So she was, and actually I just recently learned that she was involved with the movement up until at least 1947. So she was a long time National Women's Party person, and Inez Haynes Irwin was too, and we'll talk about her in a minute. So there is a connection between the two, even though they, at first glance, it might not seem to be. So what brought them to Scituate? You see on the right is that great map by John Roman, who shows most of the suffragists I'll be talking about. And they came from out of town. Basically, they're all out of towners, except Inez Haynes Irwin wound up being a resident, a long-term resident of Scituate. And again, we'll talk about her. But if you see on the map, Scituate's not far from Boston. You could reach there in about an hour on the train, same line as today. And you could reach Boston from New York, say, either by train or by boat. They had great boat service, and some people preferred that too. And then from Washington, D.C., of course, there was great train access. So this just gives you an idea. Scituate was convenient. Of course, I have to admit, Marshfield, Duxbury, Cohasset, some of these other places were equally convenient for the summer, but Scituate at least checked that box. The other main reason for them to come to Scituate, which should be no surprise to those of us who live in Scituate, are the beaches. And this is again the Peggotty Beach, early 1900s, a very attractive place, in my mind, one of the most beautiful beaches in the world. And then, this is really not well documented. I don't really have a good answer for people to say, why did all these people come to Scituate? But it seems like this was it wasn't like a recognized thing. Everybody came for different reasons. But Inez Haynes Irwin was one of the first. She and her family started summering here in 1901 next to Peggotty Beach. And about the same year, she was engaged with Maudwood Park in establishing the College Equal Suffrage League, which mushroomed, and there were chapters at all kinds of women colleges by the late first century or first decade of the 1900s. And then in 1912, she was by then living in New York City, as were many of the others that I talk about. She joined a club called Heterodoxy, and that was composed of some, free-thinking people, free-thinking women who had been involved in the suffrage movement. Some were quite liberal, others not so much, but it was a club that lasted for a while and included major suffragists, Inez Milholland, for example, and Beatrice Forbes Robertson, who we'll talk about later too. So there was all these connections in New York City that transferred over to Scituate. And then in 1916, when the National Women's Party was formed, as I mentioned, Inez Haynes Irwin was on their executive committee. And in 1922, they called on her to write the history of the National Women's Party, which she did. And it's a pretty good book. So I have to say, Inez is probably one of the linchpins behind Scituate becoming a summer destination for these suffragists. Inez had a circle. She was a writer. She became a popular writer of the Maida series of children's books. She wrote articles, but she had a knack of surrounding herself with other writers, poets, theatrical people. So there was quite a contingent of people here in the early 1900s. Now, she lived over on Second Cliff. If you're coming from the harbor area, you have to go across a bridge today. Back then, it was a causeway, and it led, what you're looking at here on this old postcard is Second Cliff. And just to the right of the center is a bungalow that was the home of Harry Haynes, who was an older brother of Inez Haynes Irwin. And then to the right, which is also to the right of that water tower, is the home of Inez Haynes Irwin. So they lived next to each other, and they had a friend of hers who actually was the architect for both houses. And this architect was also friends with Will Irwin, who was the second husband of Inez Haynes Irwin, and introduced them. So he was the one responsible for them getting together. But in this postcard, you can see hardly any trees. That's different today. You can see a water tower at the top. Actually, there were several. I'm not sure which one this is. And the Inez Haynes Irwin house is not there anymore. The Harry Haynes house is. So that's one of the last remaining artifacts or houses of the suffragists in town. So the Haynes family, by the way, they had started renting cottages just off to the right at Peggotty Beach, and then Harry and then Inez built these houses, so they were kind of committing to Scituate as a summer destination. Okay, Harry had an interesting place. This is a map furnished by a Haynes descendant, who was very kindly furnished it to me. At the top of it is the house itself, which is still there. And at the bottom, which is right next to Peggotty Beach Road, that is tennis courts. And they had one of only 3 tennis courts in town. It was a very popular place, and all their friends who were artists and poets and writers. They all loved to play there, except for Beatrice Forbes Robertson, who was more of a swimmer than a tennis player. So Will Irwin, I mentioned, entered the scene. He was a reporter and a writer, and he wrote quite a bit, including a biography of Herbert Hoover. He was noted for being a reporter for the Sun newspaper in New York. In 1904 is when he started there. And of course, in I guess it was 1906, he had moved there from San Francisco. When there was a great earthquake in San Francisco, he reported on it, but from a distance. He wanted to go there, but they said, no, forget about it. It'll take you forever to get out there, and by the time you get there, all the news might be gone. So you write about it from here in New York. So he did, and he had a photographic memory of all the bars and restaurants and flop houses and streets and meeting houses and everything else in San Francisco. And he wrote, The City That Was the name of the series, and it went on day after day and week after week, and he was famous for that. Let's see, by 1912, of course, he knew Inez Haynes Irwin, and maybe through her he became more interested in the suffrage movement, but he was probably an original suffragist from the early 1900s. In 1912, he was clearly involved in the Men's League and participated in the New York City Parade, where the Men's League was out in full force. This was the Men's League for women's suffrage. So this is an important aspect to the women's suffrage movement because in the past, the men had kind of, excuse me, I'm doing something here. The men had been basically laughing at the women. Once thousands of men joined the parade in 1912, men weren't laughing anymore. They could see that the women who were marching were really their daughters, their wives, their mothers. They really could identify with them as opposed to making fun of them. And Will wrote articles about that, which I think promoted the women's suffrage movement and helped. Another article he wrote in 1914, I got to mention this, is called Togo, the Mayor of Scituate, and it's online. You can see it if you Google that phrase. It's an article from the American Magazine, and it's all about Scituate summer life. It's probably the best description of what summer life was like in Scituate back then, and it's got some great illustrations too, which I put in the book, but I'm not putting in this presentation. And then in 1914, before America got involved in World War I, but after the World War started, he went over to report on it, and he was pretty aggressive reporter. It turned out that he first got arrested by the Germans. He was probably the first English-speaking person, along with a couple colleagues, who were arrested by the Germans, and then they released him because they were not at war with America. And they wound up getting arrested by the French and then by the English. So he actually upset the English, some factors of the English royalty. So he was arrested by all kinds of people covering that. And he got injured in the war too. He lost some of his hearing. Fascinating guy. He's written a autobiography, and then there's a good biography about him, which also goes into the house where they lived in Scituate, and a lot more detail than I went into in my book. But Will was he was in love with Inez from the moment that he met her in 1904, and he spent summers here in Scituate starting in 1905, and I think he probably didn't miss any summers except for the time that he was in Europe covering World War I. So just to show you that his attachment and Inez's attachment to Scituate, because they love the town history and they love to show it off to other people. You may have seen this booklet for sale by the Scituate Historical Society. It looks like this one is no longer available. I hope it goes back in print because it's a wonderful booklet. It's about 48 pages, and Will wrote the bulk of it, which is called The Story of Scituate, covers its history, all along, and has lots of nice photos of old houses. Inez wrote the legends for a map that's at the end, which is a great map. And she also wrote legends for the program. I think she wrote the program itself, because when Scituate celebrated its 300-year anniversary in 1636, they had Francis Perkins come in from out of town and give a talk. They had pageants and plays and talks and tours. It was a big deal at the time, and this booklet kind of compresses all that into one booklet. So I really recommend it if you have a chance to see it. Okay, the next person I want to talk about is Beatrice Forbes Robertson Hale. She began as an actress in England. She was involved with the suffrage movement there from the early part of the 1900s. She was a speaker through most of her life. She became a writer and published several books, including one called provocatively What Women Want, 1914, and that was about the women's feminist movement. So she was as much a feminist as she was a suffragist. But clearly by 1910, when she got married, she was a very active suffrage activist, and in New York City mostly, but then she went on tour around the country, and she went out as far as Colorado on her speaking tours from 1910 through 1919. She was probably the most traveled suffragist there was, and unfortunately her name has just been totally forgotten. She worked really hard for the suffrage movement, for feminism, and for the United States during the war. She was also a member of the Heterodoxy Club, so she had those contacts with others in New York City. And in 1915, there was an incident where she got some national press for her suffrage twins. She had one daughter, and then she had two daughters who were twins, who were taken to Peggotty Beach and evidently appeared nude while they were changing their diapers or something like that. And a woman reported them to the police. So it was a big deal at the time. I don't have time to go into it, but it's a fascinating sidelight of Scituate history and how Scituate was perceived in the press at the time, besides the Mossers, of course, who were out there working on the beaches. So she was important to the suffrage movement in a couple aspects I want to mention. There was a big parade. There were parades starting in New York City in 1910 for suffrage. And by 1912, they grew to be really big. They were probably the biggest ones in the country that had ever happened, at least the one in May 1912. And Beatrice was in that, on the upper left, in that group of horse riders who led the parade. And then you can see at the bottom right this great photo of the suffragists coming up Fifth Avenue, really in a large crowd. And behind them, of course, were the Men's League, a large contingent of them. That's the one that Will Irwin reported on. And of course, Will and Beatrice got to know each other in Scituate at Peggotty Beach and in social gatherings and stuff like that. So there were a lot of connections in Scituate as well as in New York City. I think Will marched in this parade as well. And then also who marched in this parade was Beatrice's husband, who she just married in 1910, and I'll talk about him in a second. So this parade in May 1912 was the largest suffrage parade that had happened up to then, and it was eclipsed by an even larger parade in October of that year in New York City. It was a torchlight parade, and Beatrice was the leader of that parade. So she played a really important role in the suffrage movement. Now this is her husband. This is a college photo. He went to Harvard. He became a lawyer. He went to Harvard Law School and became a lawyer. He was a poet actually at Harvard, and then wanted to be a poet later and dropped his law business for a while, became a poet, and had one book published of his poetry. But he met Beatrice when he was going to a suffrage rally and she was speaking. He was interested in suffrage, and his mother was a suffragist as well. She had gone to one of the women's colleges. So he was bewitched by Beatrice and married her quickly. And by 1911, he was on the executive committee of the Men's League, which had formed about a year before that in New York City. That also mushroomed, and there were branches in Boston and other major cities in the United States. He participated in their 1911 parade, suffrage parade, where the Men's League had some presence, and then also the 1912 parade, where they had a larger presence. And he and Beatrice both attended a suffrage meeting that was promoted and got a lot of publicity. So now moving to another group of people, how shall I put this? The biggest parade for suffrage was in New York City in late 1912. And that was eclipsed again by the Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. in March, I think it was, 1913. That had never happened before in Washington. They had one parade, kind of a protest parade, shortly after the Civil War, and then things were quiet. So this parade was really the first organized parade in Washington, D.C., and it happened to promote the suffrage movement, and I'll talk a bit about it in a second. But two of the women who were deeply involved in setting that up were Carol Moore on the left and Marie Moore Forrest on the right. And both of them would later wind up living on Third Cliff, actually about 3 houses away from where I'm talking right now and where I live right now. But Carol Moore she was the second wife of William Moore, and William Moore's daughter from his first marriage is Marie Moore Forrest on the right. But Carol was in charge of the homemaker section. See, the parade had all these different sections, people from different states, people from different colleges, people from different countries, people from different professions, like the homemakers. And then Marie Moore Forrest was in charge of the hospitality committee. So they were both involved in the suffrage movement early. William Moore, I want to talk about him in the center. He was originally from Duxbury. He became a naval officer and spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. And then after he retired about 1906 or 1910, he moved back to Massachusetts, I think Duxbury, but he became a state representative, and he represented Scituate as well as Duxbury in the state legislature for a couple years. And this photo is taken from one of those books that show legislators of the time. He was a good guy. He had actually attended the U.S. Naval Academy, and he was a town auditor in Duxbury, and promoted, legislation to protect the North River. So he was probably an early environmentalist too. So he was a nice guy. And I got to mention, 1910, he was one of the original members of the Men's League of Boston. And we have another person I'm going to talk about who came to Scituate who was also an original member, but he was a suffragist from the start. So his wife and his daughter both participated in this parade. This is a wonderful cover for the booklet that accompanied the parade. And Susanna used part of this for the poster for this talk tonight. How could I put it? The parade was organized in short order. Alice Paul was in charge of it. She went on to become the leader of the National Women's Party and probably the most dynamic leader of the women's suffrage movement. But she was given the charge to do this in, I think, about December of 1912. She had less than 3 months to organize this, less than 2 months. She wanted to have it the day before the new President Wilson, was inaugurated. So there would be a lot of crowds from out of town there to see the procession. And the police chief said, no, we're going to have it some other day because we can't control the crowds. And she insisted on that day, and they finally overruled with some political persuasion, they finally overruled the police chief. So it was actually held the day before Wilson got there. And when he arrived at the train station that afternoon, he said, "Well, where is everybody?" They said they're all off watching the parade for women's suffrage. So it was kind of a funny welcome to Washington for President Wilson. And the parade went pretty well for a while, but then there were so many people, so many men who surrounded the marchers that what started off as a rank of maybe 20 women across soon collapsed down to one or two across, and then were totally stopped by the men who were spitting on the women, kicking them, swearing at them. It was really a terrible scene, and it actually was, Alice Paul thought this was great for publicity. Got a lot of publicity and sympathy for the suffrage movement. So it's one of the major events in the history of the suffrage movement. And there were 2 or 3 of our summer Scituate residents who were involved in it. Here's another person, Meyer Bloomfield and his wife Sylvia Bloomfield. Meyer was, again, one of those early 1910 members of the Men's League of Boston, and marched in some of their parades in Boston. So, but his ties go back earlier than that. What I'm showing you here on the left is their house on Third Cliff, which stood there until about 2 years ago when it was demolished and replaced. It's right at the end of the Driftway. If you go past the Scituate Country Club and keep going, just before you reach the ocean, you're going to want to take a right turn onto Collier Road. And right at that point is where this house was. It was one of the earliest houses built by George Welch. It was kind of a prototype for his other houses in Third Cliff in Scituate. And on the right is a photo of Meyer Bloomfield. This photo is not in the book, by the way. I really like this photo, but the other one just was, I don't know, crisper or something more solemn. I think it was their wedding photo, but this one is obviously not their wedding photo. Maybe a honeymoon, maybe later. Maybe they're at Atlantic City or someplace like that. But they were living in Boston at the time for the first couple decades of the 1900s. And I'll talk about each of them on the next chart. By the way, they were on Third Cliff as of about 1918 or 1919, so it was towards the end of the suffrage movement. They wound up living right next to Carol Moore and Marie Moore Forrest, so there was really an interesting connection there. I'd love to have found some correspondence between them, but I didn't. But I'm sure there was a lot of connections there. So anyway, Meyer was a lawyer, went to Boston University Law School. He was a great social reformer. He wound up basically starting the field of vocational guidance, which gives you guidance counselors in schools, and the field of industrial relations, which gives you the human resources function in businesses today. So he was quite a prominent person through his work. And keeping to the left column, as I mentioned, he was on the executive committee of the Boston Equal Suffrage for Good Government League. And that was one of the first, one of the most important suffrage organizations in Boston for many years. And it eventually wound up becoming the Boston League of Women Voters, which is still around today, as far as I know. And then on the right, a few words about Sylvia, his wife. They met at the Civic Service House. She was a volunteer. He was in charge of it. It had started in 1901 in a building in the north end of Boston. Its goal and purpose was to serve the immigrants from Italy, the Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, in settling them into the United States, in educating them, in promoting civic virtues for things like voting. So it was a really important place, and I discovered in my research for this book that the place is still there, and it still houses an Italian restaurant, which I highly recommend it, but I'm not sure if they're open these days of coronavirus. But anyway, it was a wonderful place, solely devoted to the civic service house that was, I think, 5 stories tall, except in the first story was a garment manufacturer. Sylvia was an opera singer, and she later joined the Boston League of Women Voters. So she was involved behind the scenes in the suffrage movement. Now, the great couple who I love talking about, Sylvanas Smith on the left and Judith Smith on the right. I'm going to spend more time on Judith, but I got to tell you, Sylvanas was involved in the suffrage movement a little bit earlier than Judith. If you look at the formal records that I could find, he was from Duxbury. He built houses there. Then he built ships. His father had been a sea captain. He and his wife then moved to Pembroke near a bend in the North River. And actually right next to, probably just across the river from Norwell. And they were there for about 20 years until he moved to East Boston and then continued his shipbuilding there. He was one of the most important shipbuilders in America. And I'll talk about him more in a second. So Judith was from Marshfield, and she was teaching school in Duxbury, and I believe that's how they met. It turns out they're both descendants of the Mayflower, and they're both buried in the Mayflower Cemetery in Duxbury. So if you continue on Route 3A south of Marshfield, eventually you'll come to the Mayflower Cemetery that's on the right there, right next to a big church. So there's a lot of history, South Shore history here. It's not just Scituate, it's South Shore, and it's national as well. Here's a ship that Sylvanas Smith built. It's called the Paul Revere. It was built in 1876 at his shipyards in East Boston. By then, his firm was called Smith and Townsend. It was interesting, and I just found this out in the last week or so. He was partnered with let me back up. The most famous clipper ship builder was Donald Mackay, who came from Canada. Even I had heard about Donald Mackay before. I didn't know much about clipper ships. I've since learned a lot, but Donald Mackay was the guy. He's always talked about as the kind of the main builder and architect of clipper ships. And he wound up migrating to East Boston. But there were 3 or 4 others who were equally important: Samuel Hall, Paul Curtis, and Sylvanas Smith. And Paul Curtis, I just found out just a couple days ago, was born in Scituate. So he moved first to Medford and then to East Boston, and he wound up being a partner with Sylvanas Smith in East Boston. And I believe that the wharf that they used, the shipyard that they used, eventually wound up being used by Sylvanas Smith to build this ship. I think it's just a glorious painting. It's now in the home of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I was clued into this by a descendant of Sylvanas, Judith Smith, who I think is out there listening to this presentation. But I really appreciate this whole thing. It just expanded beyond the scope of my book, and now I'm really into shipbuilding in East Boston. I've just filed some more documents with the state Massachusetts Historical Commission documenting the shipbuilding in East Boston. Some of this is on my website, by the way, so you can check it out if you're interested. So let's talk about Judith. Judith worked for various suffrage organizations, such as the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Organization, the New England Women's Suffrage Association, and others. And she was involved right from the start, at least from the 1870s. She was on their executive committees. She was doing just about everything you had to do to get those things working. The Woman's Journal is one of the oldest journals in America. It started in 1870, lasted until 1917, and then in various other forms into the 1920s. And this was probably the main journal for women's suffrage. It was sent out throughout the country. This is how women out west in Utah and California learned more about the suffrage movement. And of course, it was published at this location, which was also the home of many suffrage organizations. You may have already recognized this, but if you haven't, let me point out what to me is the obvious. But this shows you a scene from about 1903 on Park Street and Tremont Street in Boston. Tremont Street is running off to the right. Park Street is running off to the left. You can see the subway stations there for the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. And beyond those is the Boston Public Gardens. I'm sorry, the Commons. And then across the street, across Park Street, is Park Street Church. Moving up the hill, you eventually wind up at the State House. And halfway up the street is number 3 Park Street. These organizations were in number 3 and number 5 Park Street. The building's not there anymore, but it's that light-colored one about halfway up. And if you have ever been to number 9 Park, that's a fabulous restaurant up at the top of the street there. That was also home to the National Women's Party in 1918 and 1919, when they were getting ready to protest and heckle President Wilson when he came to town. So they not only picketed his White House, but they also picketed at his appearance in Boston. So they were pretty militant at the time. Anyway, I thought this was a great photo, and it shows you really it's in the heart of Boston. These organizations, this journal, were sending out basically information about the women's suffrage organization, and they did not neglect news about Massachusetts and even Scituate. I should mention that one of their editors had started at the Women's Journal when there was an opening, and Judith Smith had recommended her. Turns out this was a niece for Judith, but it didn't matter that it was nepotism. She wound up becoming a very important part of the Women's Journal. So I mentioned that Scituate got press in the Women's Journal in 1894. I'm sorry, I'm going to read this, but a trip was recently made to Minot's Ledge Lighthouse. This was the second one that went up there, where our suffrage friend was welcomed as the oldest visitor who had ever been hoisted to that dizzy height. They're talking about Judith Smith, by the way. True to her principles, she carried with her on the boat some copies of the Women's Journal, the first ever seen at the Light. And she left them for the benefit of the lightkeepers, who, she writes, and she quotes, I have plenty of time to read and ponder. So she was bringing propaganda to the Minot's Ledge Lighthouse. This is, of course, old Scituate Light, which went dark about, I forget the year, I think it was 1860, after Minot's Ledge Light was built. The federal government felt they had no more need for this lighthouse, and they basically all but abandoned it. If you notice in this old picture, you're looking at the Scituate Lighthouse Keeper's Cottage. That's where the lighthouse keeper stayed. And then the lighthouse itself is to the right. The beacon was taken down, so that's no longer at the top of that tall column there. And kind of in between the two in this photo is this, what looks like those outside clotheslines with kind of hoops over the top, curved hoops. That was built by Sylvanas Smith. And, you know, he built clipper ships, he built houses. Why couldn't he build something like this? But he did. He wanted to keep the sun off his visitors. And so we'll see it in the next photo here. That's the same structure, except now they have a canvas top for it with the stripes on it. And I'm pretty sure that's Sylvanas Smith in the center, just to the left of center, with a, what do you call it, pork pie hat or a straw hat. Yeah, surrounded by people who are visiting from Duxbury, his hometown. And Judith Smith is probably in there somewhere, but I really couldn't be sure how to identify her. And in the distance, you can see First Cliff. Now, this is important because 1894, well, up to 1894, that report on Judith's trip to Minot Ledge Light, they were staying at the lighthouse for summers. So it's just amazing. I never thought this would have happened, but they were staying there probably because they had connections with Samuel Hall. Samuel Hall was one of the other major shipbuilders in East Boston, where by that time Sylvanas and Judith were living. And Samuel Hall's son, named Samuel Hall, was supposed to be in charge of this old Scituate Light. And what he did was allow his friends to use the Scituate lighthouse keeper's cottage during the summer. Starting about 1863 was the earliest I could identify for the Smiths. They would basically come down for the 4th of July and then go home at night or the next day. But by the end of the 1890s, they were staying there for a month, and they got the prime month, July. All right, let's talk. So after the Scituate Lighthouse was kind of taken over, more care was taken of it. They couldn't use it anymore as of about 1894. So Sylvanas built a cottage, and it's shown here, the second from the left, and the cottage is still there, and it's still in great shape. A wonderful family lives there, and they let me come in and take a look around. But it's just a terrific remnant from the suffrage era. And it's got a plaque on the front, sponsored by the Scituate Historical Society. I've gone on to document more detail what this is, but while the Smiths were living in East Boston, they spent summers here, right in that cottage. They could come down by boat. Some of their sons liked to sail down here from East Boston. It wasn't too bad, I guess. They could take the train starting in 1870, or they could go by horseback, or possibly with a carriage behind them. Usually for the longer months, they would come down with a carriage behind them carrying all their luggage and supplies and stuff like that. So I just want to pause for a second. We're getting close to the end. I want to give an overview. This is about persistence. I hope you've been patient and persistent in staying with me during this talk. But just to give you a kind of a view of how long everything took here, 1870 was when the 15th Amendment was passed, and that gave African American men the vote. And women said, okay, we're next. It won't be long now. Well, it was long. And 1913 was the Suffrage Parade in Washington that I mentioned. I'm glossing over a whole bunch of history here, but I think these are some really important events. In 1915, I did not mention this, but there was a referendum. It was non-binding, but it was a referendum on whether women should have the right to vote. And it was turned down by men voters by 2/3 to 1/3. So 2 to 1 vote against women getting the vote. Here in Massachusetts, similar votes in New York State and a couple other major states, I think Pennsylvania too, all about the same time. What's interesting is within a year or two, New York State reversed itself. There was a lot of lobbying, a lot of women's suffrage movement there. They were quite active, and they got it reversed, but not here in Massachusetts. And then 1917 was the suffrage silent sentinels, as they called themselves, who were picketing the White House. And then in 1920, just 100 years ago, women got the vote under the 19th Amendment. And we just celebrated that last month in August, 2 months ago, sorry. So returning to Judith, she worked from, she says, 70 years fighting for the ballot. She was 100 years old when she finally got to vote. In 1920, she got to vote for president, and she got interviewed by the Boston Globe, a really long article. I've only included part of it here with her photo. And she said she's going to vote even if it rains, because she'd been fighting so long for the right to vote. So I guess I would have to conclude by saying if Judith can do it at 100 years old, after fighting so long, then the rest of us can do it. And we've got an election coming up, presidential and other election for other state offices, and that's November 3rd. So a few points to remember. You could apply for mail-in ballot. October 24 is a deadline to register to vote. And then you can take your mail-in ballot and drop it off at Town Hall between October 17 and October 30, or you can mail it in. There's a great photo on the left, sponsored by the League of Women Voters in 1920, and I think it still applies today. So I'm sure I'm forgetting something. I hope your chat line is full of questions for me, but I wanted to mention that my book is available on Amazon. It's called Summer Suffragists, and it's also available at Buttonwood Books, which is a bookstore next to Shaw's on Route 3A, just north of Scituate. It's a really fine bookstore. And if you have bought the book, thank you very much. I would appreciate it if you left some feedback on Amazon. Just a rating or a review would be great. And if you haven't bought the book, I think you'll find it interesting, and it goes to more detail about what I've just talked about. And if you want more information, you can go to my website, which, as I said, also covers things like shipyards of East Boston. It's got a little jigsaw puzzle for you about suffragism, and a few fun things like that. It's got a poem about Scituate. So I think just play around with it. I think you'll enjoy it. So that's my website, lylenyberg.com. And that's the end of my presentation. If I can get out of this, I think I will stop sharing. There we go. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you, Lyle.
Really enjoyed that.
All right, can we open it up for some questions? Does anybody have any? I don't see any in the chat quite yet. Anyone? Can raise your hand if you don't want to type it in. Lucille?
Hi, that was wonderful, Lyle. Thank you. Very, very interesting. Loved it. I was watching something on PBS about the suffragettes, and I couldn't believe the extent that they went through. They went on starvation, actually starvation diets where they got so weak. Did you come across anything like that in your getting in the history?
Oh yeah, it's hard to ignore. That I didn't have time to go into it, but you know, those pickets that started as silent sentinels, they started in January 1917, and by May 1917, the U.S. was at war, and so they were viewed as very unpatriotic. The National Women's Party, even which sponsored them, even had a split in their ranks. The one who come up with the idea of picketing did not favor continuing the picketing during wartime, and it was so their work was really unpopular. And then the police and soldiers started moving in and harassing the picketers. They would take their signs, like you saw in the photo there and on the cover of my book, and just trample them or rip them up. And the picketers would have to go back to their headquarters, which was not far away in Washington, and get more banners. And eventually, I think it was probably later in the fall of 1917, some of them started being arrested and taken to various places. And this continued from 1917 to 1919. I forget exactly which year was the most traumatic incidents, but it might have been late 1917. Women, including Alice Paul, who had gone through hunger strikes in Great Britain, were arrested and taken to a workhouse outside of Washington, D.C. And they were kept in solitary confinement. And one night was called the Night of Terror, in which they were beaten. And Alice and some others had engaged in hunger strikes, but what the guards did then was get these tubes with bags of food, liquid food, and stick the tube all the way down into their stomach and just feed them that way so that they wouldn't starve to death. So it was a horrifying situation. It was well covered by the press, and it garnered the National Women's Party and the suffrage movement a lot of positive press. So I think between the National Association of Women's Suffrage Association, who was trying to court President Wilson, and the picketers who were picketing him, I think between the two, they kind of squeezed him into a situation where he finally gave in and supported the suffrage movement. But I think it took both a push and a pull there for that to happen. But yeah, the hunger strikes and the imprisonment there were a big deal. And I should mention that women were jailed in Boston. They were spent overnight, and then were sentenced to jail by the judge. And that's the only time, other than this time in Washington, D.C. A lot of people don't know about that, but Boston's a pretty important place for that kind of activity. But thank you for the question.
Well, they were going through the
Horrifying
same.
to watch. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
They were going through the same problem in Canada at the same time.
Canada?
Basically. Yeah, with women's suffrage.
Yeah, Great Britain, of course, earlier, before 1912 or so, they were even more militant than the National Women's Party. They were into throwing rocks through windows and getting arrested and hunger strikes and stuff like that. So they weren't quite, the Americans didn't go quite that way. Canada I didn't look at, but I did pretty extensive search in America. I could find no other places. There was actually New York. Some women were arrested, but they were held in a cell for a couple hours and then released. So in my mind, if you're sentenced by a court, that only happened in Boston and Washington, D.C.
Hi, Lyle. This is Mimi and Joe from Shoreham.
Hi.
Shoreham, Long Island.
Oh my gosh, nice to see you. Wait. From Shoreham and from, where'd you go to school?
No, it's Shoreham,
Long Island.
Yeah.
Home of summer.
Home of the summer suffrage.
Another waterfront place that was the home of summer suffragists.
And where did you go to school?
Us, you, Terriers.
So we loved your book, and we're going to do more research, but we're going to come and visit you because we have a lot in common. We were both, Shoreham, New York was, we had Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Sue and Harriet Stanton Blatch, and we have a whole history here too. But we're also a summer community with a lot of women and writers, and so it's very interesting.
Very similar, parallel histories.
Yeah. So thank you. Your book's great.
Thank you very much.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. I'm really glad you joined.
Yeah.
Wonderful
thank you.
talk.
Anyone else have a question?
I think you covered everything. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. Well, I didn't cover everything, so you should read the book. There's a lot more material there. Actually, I didn't talk about the most heartrending part of it. It was very difficult for me to write because here's Beatrice talking about her husband's affairs with various women. She's writing to him, and she's really heartbroken. And it's letter after letter of this. I mean, this guy kept up with a lot of these affairs, and it's all out there. It was hard to write, but I think you'll appreciate reading it. I don't know if you'll be upset with it or what, but there's a lot more to it than just what I talked about tonight.
Well, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more question, Lyle.
Hi.
Your interest on the clipper ships, do you think you'll be writing a book on that? It seems to be a passion for you right now.
Well, I put a lot of other things on the back burner, like histories of Scituate, so I wouldn't feel, I'd feel feel disloyal if I,
Aha,
if
okay.
I, but I got asked the same question by someone else. I said, well, I don't have a book, but I've got a 9-page paper.
Oh,
I
okay.
just wrote it and submitted to the Mass Historical Commission. It'll be filed there. I'm going to try to put a link to it so you can download it from my
Good.
website, but I haven't done that yet. But if you look at the website, I cover a lot of that material
Okay,
there as well.
thank you.
Great. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have one question. When he talked about, I guess in the North End where the Jews and the Italians had come in,
Oh.
and was it the Civic House or the Women's Suffrage? It's now a restaurant. I don't know where is that?
It's the Civic. It was the Civic House, and now, oh geez, I wish I remembered the name of it.
What street?
Yeah, it's Salem Street.
Oh, okay. Is there a plaque so you can see it, or is it just?
No plaque. No plaque.
No, okay. All right.
I'm going to go to my website. Actually, I could share that now. You mind if I share that?
No.
Right ahead.
If I can. If I can't, we'll just.
I had a question. Anyway,
Yeah.
copy of the video because I wasn't able to get online. I only could hear it through the phone, and I'd love to see the photos.
The photos of.
Yeah, it's going to be, yeah, Seth from Scituate Television actually has recorded the whole presentation, and it'll probably be up in a few days, and we'll put it onto our
Okay.
Facebook page.
Okay, so I can access it through
Okay.
your Facebook page. Do you have to have a special
think-
code or anything?
Nope, it'll be right up on Facebook, like I said, in a few days, and it'll also be on YouTube.
Okay, thank you.
Gene, most of the pictures are in the book. I bought the book, and almost all the
Okay.
pictures are in the book.
Okay, thank you.
So Lyle, you're
Okay.
looking for your website, or?
Yeah, I thought I could share that, but I don't think I have that up, but I'm looking at my website. I don't want to click on this. I'm looking at my own website on my basically computer, and I can find that on Salem Street. I've done, like, I should mention this, I've done 1, 2, 3, 4. I document these places. That's one of the things I do. I've documented over 50 places in Scituate. These are houses mostly that have not been documented before, that are historic. So I've stepped into the breach. But I did a whole bunch in Boston, mostly relating to suffrage. 3 Park Street I mentioned, 9 Park Street. Let's see. One of my favorites is right across from the Boston Public Library. And that one's still there. That was the home of all the major suffrage organizations at the time. Boston. I don't have it on my website because it did not directly relate to suffrage.
And Lyle, what's your website again? How can people get to it?
LyleNyberg.com.
Okay. So anyone can go there and check out what he's got there. And Lyle, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And, we appreciate you coming here tonight and sharing this with us. And thank you to everyone who joined us as well. We'll see you back here hopefully in 2 weeks when we talk about old oaken buckets, and which is kind of a hot topic here in Scituate all the time about the Scituate water supply. Jim Galinsky, who was here for this presentation, he had to go. He will be the presenter, and that'll be on October 14th. So you can do the same thing you did here, register, get the link, and join us. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much again, everyone. Thanks, Lyle.
Okay. Thank you all.
And everyone have Everyone have a great evening.